On Monday, the World Food Program said they're in a race against time to prevent a famine in Yemen. This is the executive director, Ethering Cousin, who just returned from Yemen.
We have about 3 months of food stored inside the country today. We also have food that's on the water on the way there, but we don't have enough food to support the scale up that is required to ensure that we can avoid a famine. What we've been doing is taking the limited amounts of food that we have in the country and spreading it to as far as possible, which means that we've been giving 35% rations on most months. We need to go to 100% rations.
So the U.S. is supplying weapons for the Saudi campaign, the war campaign in Yemen. The strikes have increased. What do you think needs to happen to save the people of Yemen at this point?
At this point, really, the only solution is some kind of agreement between the parties to the conflict, the Saudis and their allies and the Houthis. And over the last year, 18 months, several times we've been close to seeing an agreement that would at least produce a ceasefire or end some of the relentless bombing that's been going on. Yet every time the agreement breaks down. And I mean, this is a case where if the war continues, people will die from famine. I don't think there's any question about that. We just have to find a way for the war to end. And right now, there's just a complete lack of diplomatic effort to try and solve this situation. And I think as a humanitarian representing the Norwegian Refugee Council, we can do what we can, you know, in the face of this conflict, but the fundamental solution is an agreement between the parties that will stop the war, open up commerce, you know, have the port be open, and allow, therefore, the aid machinery from the World Food Program and non-governmental organizations like NRC to function.
I mean, this is not the U.S. intervening and trying to broker an agreement between others. This is the U.S. directly involved in causing this conflict.
And, Amy, it needs to be stressed that this is not something that, you know, started on January 20th. Humanitarian agencies in Washington, you know, myself and my colleagues, we've been pointing out, dating back well into the last year of the Obama administration, that, you know, the bombing campaign was leading to an untenable humanitarian situation. And the U.S. support of that bombing campaign was highly problematic from a humanitarian standpoint. So, you know, this is something that the U.S. has been driving for some time. And again, as with many things right now, it has to be seen within the context of the war or the proxy war between, you know, the Saudis and Iran for, you know, control and supremacy in the Middle East. The Houthis are perceived as an Iranian proxy. Many dispute that, but that doesn't change the fact that there's an ongoing war that seems unable to be resolved. And we need, and again, it doesn't necessarily have to come from the U.S. Perhaps it can come from the UN under the leadership of their new Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. But we need a diplomatic initiative as it relates to Yemen to avert the famine.
I want to ask about the U.S. threats to cut billions of dollars in funding to the United Nations. Can you talk about the effect of this, and what is President Trump saying?
Well, the budget will come out tomorrow, but the report is that there'll be 50% cut across the board in Trump's budget for 2018. Now, the U.S. is a very significant supporter of the humanitarian arms of the United Nations, as well as the UN across the board. But in the context of 20 million people being on the brink of famine, you're proposing to cut funding for the High Commissioner for Refugees, the UN Refugee Agency, for the World Food Program that Earthren Cousin represents, and for UNICEF. And those three agencies are on the UN's behalf on the front line of responding to the situations that we're talking about. So to call this ill-timed is an incredible understatement. I mean, and the other rumor, Amy, is that, you know, there are going to be devastating cuts to the U.S.'s own humanitarian funding through agencies like the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance and the Refugee Bureau at the State Department. So we're anxiously awaiting the release of the Trump budget tomorrow. But we're obviously quite concerned that in the context of the massive need that we're facing and the normal U.S. leadership that we see in responding to famine situations, these cuts, not just for the UN, but also for domestic, for our international response agencies and the U.S. government will be devastating.
I wanted to turn to the new UN Secretary General. You referenced, Joel, Antonio Guterres, recently calling on greater international financial support.
One of the biggest obstacles we face now is funding. Humanitarian operations in these 4 countries require more than $5.6 billion this year. And we need at least $4.4 billion by the end of March to avert a catastrophe. Despite some generous pledges, just $90 million has actually been received so far, around 2 cents for every dollar needed. We are in the beginning of the year, but these numbers are very worrying. Funding shortages have already forced the World Food Program to cut rations in Yemen by more than half since last year. And without new resources, critical shortages will worsen within months.
That's Antonio Guterres, the new UN Secretary General. I want to turn to a mother of 9 children in South Sudan.
Currently, we have no food, and the entire family depends on water lily and date palm.
Joel Charney, can you talk about South Sudan?
South Sudan's a place where, you know, there was so much hope in 2011 when the country was founded after years of support from around the world, including from the United States. And basically the leaders of South Sudan decided that they would rather fight over ultimate control than govern their country in a way that worked for all their people. So South Sudan is a classic example of another famine or food shortage that's driven purely by conflict in this, with an ethnic dimension, but also a political dimension, unresolved political conflicts within the South Sudanese ruling class that date all the way back to the 90s, that were covered up during the independence struggle but have since emerged. And again, in South Sudan, we face just immense logistical difficulties in reaching people like the woman you just showed. And we have to overcome obstacles from the government itself. We have to overcome logistical difficulties. We have to make sure that we can work safely in the midst of conflict. And South Sudan has oil. South Sudan has relatively fertile soil to feed itself. And the issue is just the inability of the authorities and working with outside aid agencies to come together to meet the needs of the people of South Sudan. And it is a desperate situation. Of the four countries that we're discussing, South Sudan is the one place where a famine has officially been declared in one part of the country, affecting 100,000 people.
And can you talk about Somalia and Nigeria, Joel Charney?
Well, Somalia, I mean, Amy, I know I'm depressing your listeners, but I mean, Somalia is the one place, I think, where a rapid response actually can make a difference, because although there is conflict in Somalia, The famine threat this time, the severe drought, is mainly in parts of the country that are reachable by the government, as weak as it is, and reachable by the international aid community. So if we're able to mobilize quickly, and this is what everyone's saying right now, if we're able to mobilize food and cash quickly, we can overcome the situation of Somalia if we get moving. In Nigeria, it's a question of, Boko Haram is disrupting areas in the northern part of the country. There's been a response by the Nigerian government that has, led to people being driven into camps and away from their homes. And because of the conflict there, food production has been disrupted. It's very difficult to reach people. And again, from the perspective of an outside agency like Norwegian Refugee Council, the key in northern Nigeria is either to reach some kind of peace agreement or at least a way to prosecute the war that doesn't disrupt life in villages and doesn't harm people who are so vulnerable.
I wanted to end by going back to where we began in Yemen. President Trump met with Saudi Arabia's Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman at the White House Tuesday, during which the two reportedly discussed their opposition to the Iran nuclear deal. They also are expected to discuss U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia for this ongoing Saudi-led bombardment of Yemen, which has killed thousands. Amnesty International urged Trump to block the arms sales, writing, "Arming the Saudi Arabia and Bahraini governments risks complicity with war crimes, and doing so while simultaneously banning travel to the U.S. from Yemen would be even more unconscionable." Joel, tonight at midnight begins what they call the Muslim ban 2.0. When people from 6 countries, including Yemen, will not be allowed into the United States unless it's stopped in court. How does this go together with what you're seeing right now in these places?
Well, as people have pointed out, 4 of the 6 countries in the ban are currently in conflict in which the U.S. is involved. And our view on the ban is very simple. The people in these countries, and indeed refugees worldwide, are among the most vulnerable in the world. They are vetted before they come to the United States. And it's just an absolute priority from our standpoint that the U.S. remain open to the most vulnerable refugees, and that we have an immigration program that from these countries that allows people to reunify with their families, to study in the U.S. and so on. So, this contrast between assaulting, having wars going on, yet not being able to be a safe haven is obviously a clear and worrying contrast.
Joel Charney, I want to thank you for being with us, Director of the Norwegian Refugee Council USA, and of course we'll continue to cover the story. When we come back, why are 8 men scheduled to die in Arkansas within 10 days? We'll talk about the reason. Stay with us.